This is a horror narration channel. Let me tell you about my life on oil rigs as a saturation diver. Most of my adult years were spent alone, working at depths that reached nearly 1,000 feet underwater. Once you're that deep, there's no simple escape, not even from death. You face whatever comes, decompressing at an agonizingly slow pace. Imagine this. After just 1 hour at 250 feet, you need 5 hours to decompress properly. If you don't, the gases from the compressed air you've been breathing expand painfully, causing decompression sickness or the bends. The consequences? Excruciating pain, or even death. That's why we always ascended carefully, slowly. Following this process was vital. Without it, I wouldn't be here to tell my story. I dedicated 8 years to this job before I truly understood the risks involved. If I'd heard a story like mine back then, I might have laughed. But this isn't some exaggerated tale shared over dinner and contraband beer. No, this is my story. Even if some scoff, dismiss it, or think I'm just looking for attention, I know what I saw. Now, when I hear people claim there are no mysteries left in the world, I laugh at them. Because I've met things beneath the waves that no one would want to encounter. My time on the Jupiter oil rig changed everything. When the decision was made to move the rig to a new oceanic site, it meant endless overtime and nearly sleepless nights for the crew. We were compensated well, so no one complained at first. But you can't put a bunch of restless workers out in the middle of the ocean indefinitely without issues arising. Soon, tempers flared and a few brutal fights broke out, resulting in some of the crew being sent home. Those who remained, including our boss Harvey, took on the task like heroes. Harvey practically lived on the Jupiter and loved his rough, rowdy team, despite the headaches they sometimes caused him. Once the rig was in place, it was time for my job to start. I'd worked on the surface during the move, but now I had to descend into the pressurized metal tube below the flatbed boat with John, my diving partner. We were stationed there to get everything operational underwater, connecting pipelines, ensuring stability, keeping the valves in check. To live underwater indefinitely, we had to saturate our bodies with gases that allowed us to adapt to the depth. This made us valuable assets, and we knew it. But unlike me, John didn't care much for the isolation. If he could get the same pay at a beachside janitor job, he'd take it in a heartbeat. As for me, the solitude felt like freedom. I thrived in the silence, away from the chaos above. On the flatbed above us, a team ensured we had everything we needed. They managed our air supply, food, and comfort, knowing that any mistake on their end could be fatal for us. We had a medical crew on standby, but nobody ever wanted to call them. If that happened, it meant the situation was likely beyond saving. That's where the story begins. Beneath the waves, in a place most would consider unexplored, I discovered that some mysteries in this world are best left undisturbed. At first, my job as a saturation diver was just another routine. The first couple of weeks were dull, almost too perfect, no unusual sightings, and not even the typical sea life that usually hovered around our workspace. John, my partner, was wrapped up in his personal drama, particularly about a girlfriend who he'd allowed to date someone else while he was away. I couldn't relate. Relationships didn't mix well with this job. During our third week, John and I finished setting up a test pipeline and returned to our pressurized metal chamber. As we waited for dinner, he attempted to call his girlfriend, but his expression shifted to a nervous smile. He leaned forward and asked me, "Did you hear that?" There was an uneasy silence, and his behavior seemed off, but we shrugged it off and ate in silence. The next day, John's unease worsened. His pale face and darting eyes betrayed a rising fear. As we prepared for the next shift, he asked if I'd noticed anything strange underwater. I laughed it off. Deep-sea creatures always look weird to the untrained eye, with their strange lights and odd behaviors. But nothing out of the ordinary had happened. That night, John's health took a downer. His vitals were off, and the medical team decided to put him in an isolation chamber, fearing he was sick. Even a cold could spell disaster underwater, where blocked sinuses and unequal pressure could be fatal. I realized I'd be down there alone for at least a month, managing both our tasks. The following day, I set out to inspect the pipeline John and I had set up, only to find parts missing and the whole structure needing to be redone. It felt like I was working against the clock in a race I didn't understand. The medical team wouldn't tell me exactly what was wrong with John, which unnerved me even more. The next day, I descended alone, and immediately, something fell off. The lights that usually shone brightly across the seafloor appeared dimmer, almost as if the darkness itself was pressing in. I asked the crew above to check the lighting system, but they confirmed that everything was in order. Despite their reassurance, the water seemed eerily still, and my instincts screamed that something wasn't right. Hours passed and fatigue crept in, but I kept pushing. Several times, I noticed flickers of movement in my peripheral vision, but each time I turned to look, there was nothing, just an unshakable feeling that something was watching me, lurking just beyond the reach of the lights. As I began my ascent, finally leaving the strange darkness behind, I felt a presence moving just out of sight, trailing me in the pitch-black water. Whatever was down there with me wasn't human, nor was it anything I'd encountered before. The silent shadows of the deep were no longer just eerie. They were actively menacing, and I had the sinking feeling that this descent would not be like the others. Panicked, I swung my light frantically through the water, desperately searching for the source of the bump. My mind immediately jumped to shark, a common hazard, though they usually kept their distance. I pulled myself up the line, my heart pounding, when something brushed past me again, gently but unsettlingly. This time, I caught a glimpse of the creature in my light beam. Its silhouette was reminiscent of a stingray, yet as it swam away, I noticed what looked like arms, long strands of hair, trailing in the water. My heart raced, but I forced myself to keep calm, steadying my breathing as I continued up the line. Just when I thought I could dismiss the encounter as a trick of the deep-sea shadows, the creature appeared directly in front of me, blocking my path. It was enormous, at least twice my size and far more terrifying up close. Its midsection was wide and flat, almost ray-like, but it had webbed fingers with black talons clutching my line and almond-shaped eyes that occupied most of its face. Below those eyes was a round mouth filled with tiny, sharp yellow teeth. The creature loomed closer, and instinctively, I kicked backward, releasing the line to avoid its advance. In my frantic attempt to escape, I collided with something else behind me. Tentacles snaked around my body, gripping me painfully tight, puncturing my suit with tiny spikes. My radio was dead. No help was coming from above. The thing holding me started dragging me down, further and further into the blackness. Meanwhile, the other creature swam down, circling us in the water, tapping on my mask with its talons, as if toying with me. I wanted to scream, but fear choked the sound before it could escape. The tentacled monster eventually hauled me to the seabed worksite. It pinned my arms to my sides with one powerful tentacle, then held me in front of it, almost as if it wanted me to take a good look at its terrifying form. Its body was sinewy and undulating, squid-like, but entirely devoid of human features. Yet its eyes conveyed a sinister intelligence. As I hung there, paralyzed by fear and the pain from its puncturing spikes, a high-pitched call reverberated through the water. I watched as more stingray-like creatures gathered, parting to face the darkness beyond us, as though expecting something even more monstrous. Then, out of the black void, a new shape began to emerge, massive and imposing. Its head alone was the size of a small car, adorned with long, willowy whiskers that floated eerily in the water. It had a mouth resembling that of a lion, only far larger and flanked by tentacles that unfurled like the limbs of some otherworldly god. Its body was long and serpentine, moving with an unsettling grace through the water as it approached. Every other creature, including the one holding me, began to shiver in what looked like fear. The massive creature's presence was almost ritualistic. The others seemed to revere it. As it glided through the throng, one of its tentacles lashed out, snatching up a smaller creature from the crowd. Its mouth didn't open. Instead, a section on its belly split apart, and worm-like appendages with smaller mouths emerged, devouring the unfortunate creature in seconds. In the chaos, the grip on me loosened, and my instincts kicked in. I floated upward, unnoticed by the creatures below, the nightmare fading as I made my silent escape toward the surface. I kept my hand steady on the line, not daring to move too quickly. Every instinct screamed for me to rush, but I knew any sudden movement would alert them. As I ascended, the dim lights of the work site shrank below, and finally, my hand clasped onto the ascent line. Heart pounding, I pulled myself up, now out of the reach of those horrors. At least I hoped so. In the tube, I felt a wave of terror consume me. Certain those creatures would claw through the steel to drag me back down, to offer me up to whatever monstrous leader ruled over them in the depths. Back on the surface, the crew dismissed my story as deep-sea madness, chalking it up to the isolation and stress of the job. But I couldn't forget. John had seemed strangely silent, and after a month of evading each other, I finally got the nerve to ask him about that final week underwater. He admitted he'd seen them too. Visions of creatures that shouldn't exist, shapes that haunted his every dive. He told me he'd thought he was losing his mind. The company, determined to finish the job, sent a 6-man team down to complete our work. 2 weeks later, they all vanished. Only one surfaced, raving about monsters before dying on the deck. His frantic account was recorded, filed along with ours, but the government ordered it all destroyed. Officials warned us to stay silent, threatening confinement in a high-security mental asylum if we spoke about what we had seen. So here I am, telling this story under the cover of anonymity. I want you to know what's out there in the deep, in the dark, before it's too late. If they come for me, if I disappear without a trace, you'll understand why.